So you just bought a camera and now you're wondering why your videos and pictures look like this while everyone else looks like this. I mean, that beautiful blurry background is what we all want to get, but why does everything that you shoot look like a cell phone, but others can take the same camera you're shooting on and create stunning images? In this video, we're going to be using different settings, tips and tricks, and even some secrets that we have learned over the years so that whatever camera you're shooting on, whether that's an iPhone, a DSLR, a mirrorless camera, or even a handy cam, we are going to show you how to take your camera and get that cinematic blurry background. Now, first off, 20 years ago, you had to have an expensive camera to achieve a blurry background. For the everyday low-budget filmmaker, you had to buy a depth of field adapter for your DV camera along with rigs and rail systems to hold it up, and it was a nightmare. Luckily, that all changed right when the 5D Mark II came out in 2008. This gave filmmakers the ability to have interchangeable lenses right on their camera without the need for adapters. This gave us the ability to get that cinematic look without spending $20,000 to have depth of field in your image. To have depth of field in your image is now super easy, and we'll show you exactly how to do it. The blurry background that we want to achieve is commonly referred to as the depth of field. This is simply just the area of your frame that is in focus. If you have a large depth of field, your subject will be in focus and the background, but if you make that area of focus much more shallow, hence the name shallow depth of field, and place that focus on your subject, the background automatically becomes blurry. So first off, the main way of controlling depth in your image is your aperture. Every lens that you will ever use has something called an aperture, sometimes referred to as an f-stop or in cinema glass, t-stops. The back of your camera will show the numbers of the aperture as a decimal. The aperture controls how much light you allow into your camera by opening and closing. This is the exact same way your eye works. When your eye dilates, it opens up and soaks in as much light as possible, and when your pupil closes, it allows less light into your eye. So with an aperture, the lower the number is, the larger the aperture and the brighter the image. The higher the number, the more closed the aperture is, the darker the image. It's brighter and darker simply because you're controlling how much light is let into the camera. But at the same time, the aperture also controls one more thing, and that is how blurry your background is. The lower the number and the larger the aperture is, the more shallow your depth of field is going to be. The higher the number, the less depth of field you're going to have. So with this first shot, I have my aperture set to f16, which is really closed. And yes, the face is in focus, but most of the background is in focus as well. If I open up my aperture down to f1.8, the image gets really bright, but if I adjust my exposure to compensate for how much light is being let into the camera, you can see that the face is still in focus and the background is completely gone. So the lower the aperture, the brighter the image is and the more depth of field that you will have. Because of that reason, if a lens can stop down to a lower aperture, it's going to be much more expensive. A 50mm f1.8 is $100, a 50mm f1.4, which opens up just a little bit more, is $350, and a 50mm f1.2 is over $1,000. And yes, they have better build qualities, but you can see just how valuable it is to have a lower aperture. All these examples were shot on a 50mm f1.8 lens, which is only $100, and I would highly recommend picking one up almost immediately because it's just so affordable and it's great to start with. So the number one way to get a blurry background is to lower your aperture. However, if you have a lens that doesn't open up that far, maybe to like f4, or maybe you're using an iPhone which doesn't even give you the ability to control your f-stop, there are some tips and tricks that you can do to achieve that blurry background. Step number one is compression. This is a real fancy way to say take your camera and your lens and zoom in. Take this shot here at 24mm f4, which is really wide, and the same shot at 70mm f4, and you can clearly see the difference. This was all done with the same lens and the same aperture. Both of these were shot with the same aperture of f4, which isn't that great, but notice how the 24mm frame, you can see a ton of the background, but at 70mm with the same aperture, the background is really just that tree and it's super blurry. This is because when you zoom in to a higher focal length like 70mm, 150, or even 200mm, you're actually creating compression that appears to bring your background closer to the subject and becomes blurrier. I wouldn't do this for every single shot because there can be some face distortion at really long focal lengths, but if you need to get that blurry background, step back and zoom in. The next step is simply distance. This is a combination of the distance from you to your subject, as well as the distance from your subject to their background. If you put your subject right up against a wall, it really doesn't matter what your aperture or focal length is because you're right next to a wall. Compare this to stepping back 10 to 20 feet away from the wall. This physically separates your subject from the background, and the background becomes blurrier, and that's because instead of your lens creating depth with your aperture, you are physically creating that depth yourself. When I have to film an interview in a small room, I will inconvenience myself and put myself as far in the corner as possible to get my subject as far away from the background as I can. By moving away from your background, you immediately create depth and give your camera the best opportunity to have that blurry background. And step number 3, one trick to achieve depth in your image that I use all the time is to simply take advantage of your foreground. Shooting around or through something gives your image great depth. If you don't have good distance, you don't have a low aperture, and you can't zoom in, shoot through something. I do this all the time on shoots. I'll shoot through leaves, a tree. Sometimes I will literally pull a branch off of a tree and carry it around with me on a shoot just to have something to hold in front of my lens to give my image that sort of depth. When you do this, you're creating more layers to your image. And the good thing is, it doesn't matter what aperture you use because a leaf 3 inches away from your lens is going to be out of focus. I personally have filmed multiple weddings with an iPhone, and I always look for something to shoot through, like leaves, or maybe come around a corner to reveal my subject. Just physically create that cinematic space that will separate you from the competition. To sum it all up, the #1 way to get depth in your image is with lowering your aperture on your lens. Again, a 50mm f1.8 is about $100 and is awesome to start with. Distance and compression can really be achieved with any budget and any lens. You just need to plan out what environment you're shooting in and how far away you can pull your subject away from the background. And remember, if you can use something in your environment to create that depth, like leaves or trees, do it. Here we have our subject, and we're using a 50mm f1.8, and the subject looks really blurry and has that cinematic depth that we want. But if we take that same shot and only have a lens that opens up to, let's say, f4 like this one, all we do is we simply bring our subject far away from the background, creating depth. We then step away from our subject and zoom in, creating distance and compression, and then we shoot through some foreground element to create even more depth. Now we have 2 cinematic images. One was with a much nicer lens with a lower aperture, and the other was with a cheap lens that has no depth of field, but we used distance, compression, and foreground elements to create that depth ourselves. So whatever camera or lens you have, you can still achieve this look. So if you'd like to learn even more about how to take whatever camera you have and create cinematic images with it, you can check out our full course at tomorrowsfilmmakers.com. We have over 1,200 training videos and over 120 hours of content on every single filmmaking subject that you can possibly imagine, taught by leading professionals in the film industry. If you'd like to join over 40,000 other students just like you, pursue your dreams, and take your skills to the next level, click the link below and sign up for our award-winning online film academy for only $97. We've provided all the tools that you need to grow, and we want to see you creating photos and video content that you are proud of. So click the link in the description below and head on over to tomorrowsfilmmakers.com and learn all the skills that you need to succeed.